Hey, how are you
I'm
doing?
doing fine. I got back from the lake. You're putting together on Lacan are just crazy. Like
Thank
I've not. I don't think there's anywhere online that is going through the text line by line and bringing it out like y'all are doing. So the amount of work that that takes and the devotion to keep working at it in the way you are, I just think is extraordinary.
Nick and I are doing, yeah, like we're doing our job to make sure that like we make not only Lacan seminars accessible, but also like we nobody is the subject expert of Lacan, no matter what. Like even if they say they are, it's like, yeah, they put in their time, but the ironic thing is that Lacan says that psychoanalysis is the only discourse that like reveals that there's no master, and yet like people want to say like, oh yeah, I'm the master of Lacan. We're struggling just as much as everybody else is to try to understand the seminars. Sometimes we don't know what we're saying, and I think that's the whole thing about like Lacan is like when you look at his thought, and it's a thought in motion, and like he'll even go back to like certain concepts in Freud and kind of reorient them in a different framework. And he's constantly fixated on like how can we understand something like desire, which is like a deadlock in Freud, something that Freud doesn't have. He has a wish fulfillment, but he doesn't have an understanding of desire in the way he'll say like desire is the desire of the other, right? Because look, for Freud, he's only got something like the wish fulfillment, and with his notion of regression, it's like, well, wish fulfillment gets fulfilled in the dream, and so like that's it. We may not have the ability to achieve our desire or pleasure in the real life because of the reality principle, but we could achieve it in the dream. But Lacan's like, and even Freud knows this, it's like in his later work, but Lacan's like, yeah, but it doesn't make sense though if we're constantly dreaming. Not only that, a nightmare isn't a wish fulfillment, and then when we understand like what's wrong with like obsessionals and hysterics, and then the war neurosis, we understand that the death drive is something that intercepts any fulfillment of a wish. That drive actually orbits around the object cause of desire, and its aim is to miss the object, and so that's why there's this insistence of the compulsion to repeat to begin with. And so that's something that, even though Freud discovers this in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he's really like afraid to carry this notion of the death drive forward, because like he says that the ego is not the master of its own house, and he shows this with like his early works and up to like when he does interpretation of dreams, and even like the ego and the id, that we realize that even in the Darwinian aspect, that the biological organism isn't aiming towards a teleological end or towards homeostasis, that this balance of two different processes diminishes any type of concrete homeostasis or mastery of the world. And then the dreams show a different side of consciousness, like, oh, there's something that's a different process going on. And now we have death drive. So not only does Freud show that human undermines themselves, but even the death drive undermines Freud himself and his theoretical achievements. So that's like the paradox that like Lacan is using dialectically to move forward. And like this is why the two seminars are very important to understand the groundwork for understanding Freud.
No, that's all magnificent. Lacan is someone, what I appreciate about Lacan as I listen on the extraordinary work that you do is the more that things come out that before you never catch, that you learn and you pick up. And like I have to admit, I was mentioning to Dimitri the other day, like when I read Hegel's Philosophy of the Right, like 12 years ago now. Wow. How things don't really pop out. And now when you go back, I've been in obsessive crazy land trying to finish this paper after on trying to argue where we have to understand the philosophy of right as the state of nature, not just the state of government, and that the state of nature is developing, and that it becomes the ground for the epistemological justifications of even saying, if you do the phenomenology of spirit and you're trying to make an explanation for the nature of the subject, of which would provide a proof to think that the science of logic is validated, because if the science of logic is going to be updating Aristotle and it makes all these arguments, at the end of the day you could just say, well, I don't believe it. He's like, well, look over here at the phenomenology of spirit. Here's a proof by the very development of the subject through history that there would be reason to think that the logic of Aristotle cannot explain why the subject would move that way. Therefore, the science of logic would make sense. But you could just counter and say, well, I don't buy the development of the state as the foundational ground for the subject. It's like, but let's see how the state develops, because by state, he doesn't necessarily mean government. He means like a collective, right? Like something emergent that is not reducible to the parts. And so it's like the state of nature. And the state of history, the state of nature is not a contract at the beginning of history that's like a hypothetical, like in Rousseau and Hobbes. In fact, the state of nature is the present now. So it's the justification of the now. Well, if the now is a justified ground for the beginning of philosophical thought, well, then the phenomenology of spirit is justified. And if that's justified, then you've justified the proof that gives you reason to think the science of logic is needed. So these things fit together. So I've always felt like in Hegel that the philosophy of right, by a lot of people more on the Zizekian side who will stress the phenomenology and the science of logic, the philosophy of right is like, they kind of brush it. They're not sure what to do with it. And don't get me wrong, it's very different in character. But I actually think there can be a double reading of it where it can actually have a role that's going on in the phenomenology of spirit and with the science of logic. But that's all to say, you go back to a book like The Philosophy of Right and it's all anew. And just going back to Lacan through you, I'm like, oh, wow. These are like in the talk you were having today on the transfer of the teacher, on the notion of incest being a kind of upsetting of the relations that structure the psyche, right? Because if you fold it in on itself, the relations do not unfold as you've been socially conditioned to think. So it's almost like the ultimate revolution in a way, right? Because the social order conditions the relations in a manner that then can more easily capture them, where then incest would be an upsetting of all of those relations. And then that would see why you have so many taboos of that. Now, I'm not saying that incest is good, but it's interesting to think. I was also taken by this idea that when Lacan talks about death, it's not necessarily death. It's like it's more of this non-existence.
Right. And for death, it's a symbolic death in which we undermine our own coordinates to identify in. It's not so much that we're an imaginary ego, but that we always look to anticipate logically in this whole thing of logical time and to deduce our position as subjects in the symbolic order. This whole thing of the logical time is like the three different sophisms of the warden who says, due to some circumstances, I got to let one of you prisoners free. And I have the two black colored discs and three white colored discs. And it's up to you to figure out who's the right one without speaking. You could only look upon each other and then reflect in your own minds. And once you finally figure out who the subject is, you may walk in and then come to tell me how you figured this out. And yet the trick is that they all are wearing white ones. And so they all deduce. And so they all leave at the same time to go tell. And pretty much he breaks down on why this is the case and why even if, you have a two black and three white, that none of them will be free. The point of this thing is that a symbolic order like this allows for certain logical things to happen and certain prohibitions or inconsistencies to happen as well in the symbolic order. And this is like how he ties off from a Levi-Straussian structuralism. He then will play it off with the odds and evens game of like marbles. You guess how many marbles are in your hand.
I'm in Squid Games now.
Yes, Squid Games definitely gets this. Squid Games gets this. Or he'll talk about it in the coin toss of heads or tails. And he says, like, if you have three different movements, right, we could picture the heads as a plus and then the minus or the tails as a minus. And so the first order would start off as the first movement, which is a minus minus, and then the second one as like a plus minus minus plus. And then, I think it's plus plus for one, plus minus, minus plus for two, and then minus minus for three. And the consistency of this logic, when you look at the movement and the probability, is that if you have a three structured movement, then the three movement of minus minus cannot exist out after a one, because as soon as it exists after a one, it already creates a movement of a two.
Right.
And so now you can get a three that comes after that if you have a fourth movement, a seventh movement, and you get these inconsistencies. So what he's trying to metaphorize is that the symbolic order is not something that's by chance or accident, but yet it's contingent into its own movement of possibilities in this mathematical schema, that contradictions exist, and yet at the same time, they are also prohibited from intruding into the game, into this sequence. So, for instance, Michael Downs likes to say this, a game of basketball can't operate with two balls, right? There's only one ball, because that would change the entire order of the structure of the game. And so something like prohibition of incest is an impossibility of enjoyment. And if it were to even happen or be obtainable, it would destroy the entire order that we see in how we structure family alliances, clans and kinsmanship. And now it's not to say that these acts aren't happening, but at the same time, when we look at certain weird families, like whether it's like in the Southern Midwest or certain cases of this, even though they are committing these prohibited acts, they still maintain a certain symbolic distance to say, this is your mother, this is your father, this is your sister, this is your son, because they realize that the symbolic order still operates on a life of its own to maintain a barrier from encountering the deadlocks of what's the matter of the gap of the symbolic order. These contradictions, these deadlocks are of jouissance, of enjoyment. That's the real, which we get into. It's not something that exists solely outside or before the symbolic order. It's actually a conditioned structure, or a condition from the lack of structure within the symbolic order, and has to be jettisoned out, but yet it still comes back as like a parasite or something.
It's magnificent. First on, it was a really good explanation. And I like how you connected incest with the idea of you can't have two basketballs. That's really good, because it's funny, because if I were to just straight up ask you, why can't you have two basketballs? You could explain it, but it actually would be kind of difficult, because I always say, well, no, we just won't have the two balls intersect, and maybe it would actually double the excitement. And yet to introduce a second basketball in a way screws everything up. And the thing that's interesting is you have a sense that it would screw everything up even before you can explain exactly why it would screw everything up. And that goes to show you how it works on a deeper level than the rational, like it gets below the rational, like you sense in your gut. And what's very interesting of that is as you were speaking, one, it made me think of Wittgenstein. I know Wittgenstein came up in the conversation, because Wittgenstein's very interesting in that I've always found him interesting, because I know he's associated with the analytical tradition, and obviously he himself, but he doesn't quite fit there.
No, he's like a post. He's like undermines the tradition.
Oh yeah, well, I really like Uncertainty. I think Uncertainty is a tremendous book.
Yeah, it's a good one.
That was a big inspiration for me doing the Uncertainty paper and conflict. Like, a lot of the Conflict of Mind has lots of references to the Uncertainty text, and that doesn't fit in an analytical framework. Also, I know people like Dr. Conant has written on the Resolute Reading, where he talks about the show-tell distinction in Wittgenstein should be questioned. But if we take that as paramount, you really couldn't make showing so primary in your thinking if you're a pure analytical thinker.
Right.
Because a showing would be meaningless, right? Because you couldn't translate it into a structure of logic of which language would come about, right? But if Wittgenstein says in Uncertainty, most of philosophy has made the mistake of looking for an explanation when ultimately we need a description.
Exactly. And this is like something like Heidegger, like you can't explain logically, or like in the way they want to frame propositions, Dasein revealing itself, being disclosed in the phenomenon, right? If we just get into a phenomenological hermeneutic investigation, I don't think analytical philosophy could account for something like that, right? And someone like Heidegger is just so dismissed just because he's like considered like, hard to read or obscure. But no, he's getting at something fundamental when he talks about both on a level of ontic and ontological, right? That things could be ready to hand, as he says, but yet, and at these moments, and how we're beings that are referential with the hammer, with other people, and this what he calls solicitation of being, that there's also a point in which things, in a sense, fail, and that's when they become present to us and kind of disclose something, and yet we could see this with, our fundamental facticity of who we are. That's something that I don't think analytic philosophy could take into account for.
Well, a way, to me, I always find very interesting. I was mentioning it to Dimitri, apparently something that Derrida, and I actually don't know if it was published by Heidegger, but somewhere he has a letter or something where he writes being with a slash through it every time when he writes being, and Derrida goes nuts. He's like, yes, that's it. Like that. He loves that notion, because what it goes to show you is that if I say being, or if I say nothing, Those are different from being with a slash to it. Right. And basically, in an analytical tradition, you can only make sense of being and nothing, but you can't really make sense of a being with a slash to it. In an analytical tradition, a being to a slash to it is just nothing. But Derrida's like, no. And then, of course, Zizek and all of them, and Lacan, obviously, are like, no. Subject, being with a slash through it is different from nothing, because it is the idea that the experience of being is always not that, just as soon as you look for it. Like,
it's interesting. It's interesting because I was listening to Cadell's wonderful. Cadell's recent discussion with Thomas Wynne on Heidegger's Hegel.
Yeah, they're both amazing. I love both of them. Yeah,
the Heidegger's Hegel episode that he did was amazing because he talks about how Heidegger, the more he starts to develop in his later thought, becomes more intimate with Hegel and realizes that, there's actually something that he's aligned with Hegel. And instead of using the negation of negation, he talks about this term of nihilating, this constant nihilation of being. That's and maybe that ties in with the whole slash in
That's
being. Right. Because even even for Dasein or being, that in one instance, it's always nihilating its prior instance, but maybe this has to do with what Hegel talks about, the this and the now, and what's going next is that not only are these like processions, but they're negations, right? It's annihilation. There's not this fluid positive process in a Deleuzian sense, or even difference, because even difference itself is non-mediated. I think we talked about this last time about with his Bergsonian roots, it's like a process of emergence, because he thinks of mediation as a false movement. It's like, no, mediation also counts as nihilation, because it's that vanishing mediator that always comes back to nihilate in the process of the fourfold movement, as Zizek points out, for they know not what they do. It's like the traditional framework of Hegel is like, well, you have your thesis, then you got your antithesis, and then you have this synthesis. But it's like what you have described as just a 3 count, but this thesis and antithesis, and the way you describe them, already posit 2 oppositionary things, but the way you define them are substantial. And this is not what Hegel is saying. It's that to affirm something is to already have negated something prior. So an affirmation already is always a negation.
That's right. Well, the thing that's so critical, like on the Wittgenstein example, like being in a room with nothing in it is different from being in a room after going on the philosophical journey and being able to be in a room where you've completed, say, the work of the subject, right? Same room with nothing going on in it, per se. If we use Pascal's idea of all the world's problems can be summed up because the average person can't sit in a room by themselves for 3 minutes. It's hilarious. It's either Pascal or Kierkegaard. I love that line. The person sitting in the room who's not able to be alone with themselves because they haven't done the work on themselves is not the same as the person who is in the room like Kierkegaard or Pascal, right? And yet, from an analytical framework, it's exactly the same. It's a room with a person sitting on the couch, right? But from a continental or a Heideggerian framework, they're not necessarily the same at all. Thomas Wynne, and obviously both Cadell and Thomas Wynne are magnificent. And when I was talking in the talk that Mr. Wynne and I had, we talked about like Heidegger and the hip-hop cipher, and how a really good way to understand Heidegger and clearing of which discloses being is in fact a hip-hop cipher. From an analytical standpoint, if I were to ask you what's going on, you would say people are standing in a circle. That's what's going on, but that's actually not what's going on. But then if you were to try to prove that these are the conditions of a certain thing emerging that cannot be predicted ahead of time, well, that would require the seeing of it, not an explanation. The explanation is guys are standing in a circle. The description, the showing is something though that cannot be reduced to that description, right? And so you would have like a circle in analytical, or no circle because nobody's there on the street. But then you have a cipher that actually is a kind of embrace of the fact that there's nothing planned, right? Like if you say what you're going to do next, you'd say, well, nothing, we don't know, right? Oh, so you have nothing planned. No. We are precisely annihilating the plan of what could occur, so something can emerge in the cipher or in the improv comedian or whatever, that then once it is there will be all the greater precisely because it was not planned ahead of time. And basically what Wittgenstein seems to understand is that language games can create conditions that give rise to something that are then not reducible to that language game, but cannot be explained before they arise. right?
Right.
And then he gets very interested, as we know, in like Master Eckhart and a lot of the apophatic Christian mystics, because there's this kind of idea that the apophatic nothing is not the same as the nothing of nothing, like just like a nothing, right? Well, that difference, which you could say is nothing versus being with a slash through it, is something that you have to experience to get, right? And then to get it, the thing that's funny about it is getting it may require making sure there's not a second basketball on the basketball court, right? Because once you bring that in, it just doesn't happen anymore, right? And so you have to make sure everything is aligned. So what's very interesting, this is what I find very interesting, because it's almost like what Heidegger's talking about with the conditions of the clearing to have being come forth, have something similar in its necessity of conditioning as a lot of what Lacan talks about with how ideology operates, right? It's almost like, in some respects, that if you don't do what Heidegger's talking about, which I do think comparing Heidegger and Hegel is really, really important, actually, because then you start situating how a lot of where Heidegger's thinking after being in time in the later Heidegger ends up sounding a whole lot of the conceptual mediation that you have to go on with Hegel. So what's really interesting to me is how it's almost like if you don't do what Heidegger and Hegel, if I put those together, are talking about, then ideology is going to do something similar, but you're just going to be trapped. So it's like you have ideology that's going to make sure the second basketball doesn't enter the court to keep the game going, or you as a subject own the conditions necessary to create a cipher that similarly can't let there be a second basketball enter the arena or it messes all up, or someone enter the cipher who doesn't have the skill to do the cipher that then makes possible the disclosure of being. But what's so interesting is there's some sort of, it's like, what's the difference between those two? It's almost like in Lacan, it's the big other doing it for you. You're being structured externally, where in Heidegger, it's some sort of internal structuring to do something of which discloses itself. And then before passing it to you, I also went down a rabbit hole reading as much Deleuze, his book on Bergson, Spinoza, trying to figure out the difference between Bergson's intuition and Deleuze's transcendental emergentism. And that's Deleuze does every day, like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'm like, I think I know where to place him. And then Tuesday and Thursday, I need more bourbon or something. I'm not quite sure. But it's interesting. It is interesting to compare the conditions that make possible the clearing in Heidegger, in which being can disclose itself, and the maintaining of the basketball game per se, in which ideology does not allow incest or the second basketball in, or it would throw down the social order. It's interesting to compare those things.
Right. And I think for the most part, it's like Heidegger, with his Dasein, it is definitely important in how being is within the world. But I think one thing that Lacan develops most is his notion of jouissance, which binds us together. And we could see the cipher not just like connecting together due to a language game or something that's being disclosed, but rather the enjoyment of a discourse that has a social bond. And what's interesting about hip hop is that the way that it has a transgression to play with language. And to talk about certain themes, but a lot of ways in which you could say something, whether it's with the cadence, whether it's with the A and B rhyme scheme. You have like the sort of Tech Nine flow, or like Wu-Tang, or just the way that you could just make one thing compared to another thing. A lot of juxtapositions, and somehow they make sense. This right here is a way to enjoy language and to make something kind of sublimate in that, right? And yet that is what quilts it together, as far as different signifiers coming, especially from freestyle. If a cipher is a freestyle, it's like you said, it's not,
exactly.
We don't have an idea of what's going on in the cipher. We don't have anything remotely going on, but as one begins to speak, then there's a collectivity of understanding. The way the words come out, they start to connect with other, they replace other signifiers to represent an absent signifier. This is how the quilting of signification happens, based upon whatever the S1 is, the master signifiers, but mainly it's bonded by jouissance, by unconscious enjoyment, by drive.
I like that language of quilting. That really is very interesting to me. And there's something also about, it's almost like you quilt or be quilted, like you quilt something in your own conditioning, because like a way I look at Heidegger, which may be wrong, may be right, who knows in these games, but there's something where the later Heidegger is interested in, okay, it would seem as if getting to being of being, the last part of being in time that doesn't end up written, seems to be something Heidegger's like, I'm not gonna, he goes in a different direction, where instead the later Heidegger I see as an emphasis, I keep saying, on clearing, which is creating a clearing for being to disclose itself. But then it's like, okay, so we can't really get to being a being, but how do we as subjects? And then it does seem, although the early Heidegger has a Dasein, I do feel as if the later Heidegger actually is more talking about a subject. Now he himself, if you said that, he may vomit, but he'd be like, screw you, I am not Sartre. And you're like, come on, man, it's not so, I really like being in nothingness. He's like, but the latter one definitely seems to be of a, how do you get yourself out of the way so that things can disclose themselves, right? Well, that's work of a kind of subject, right? And that's someone then who is doing the work of putting themselves where they're kind of controlling the quilting, per se, that goes through in their life, as opposed to being quilted by the symbolic order that one is finding themselves in. And, I've also been really interested lately, because I guess I just spend my life going down rabbit holes, on the difference between, I've been calling it the difference between wine and lumber. In Heidegger, lumber, I'm just talking about standing reserve, right? Where he talks about the river Rhine. I say lumber because I literally cannot say RH words. Like every time I try to say the river wine, I can't say it. I cannot frickin' say it. So, but he makes the example of the River Rhine as being standing reserve. It just exists to be electricity for some end. I actually failed kindergarten because I couldn't say W's and R's. Just so you know, I spelled rabbit with a W, and they're like, wow, let's hold him back. Hold that boy. But anyway, lumber is like a tree just exists to be lumber, right? Yeah. Well, it's interesting because he speaks in his book on poetry, thought, and thinking as if grapes don't realize their full being until they're turned into wine. Like literally, grapes are not fully disclosed in their being until they are wine. Really,
so it's almost like there's like, in order to realize what they are, it's like there has to be a sort of determination or in transubstantiation of their being, in which they realize, because in early Heidegger he says like the essence of being is within its existence or something like that. So would that still apply in that instance, or is that like a totally different frame of thought that he is going to kind of bring about in this instance of grapes realizing their own essence within being transformed into wine?
Yeah, so he says there's something about, and when the grapes are the wine, then the jug is the jug in its jugness with earth and sky. Yeah. It's this weird thing. So to your question, I definitely think, so he has spent his early career basically saying all of metaphysics led to standing reserve technology, the reduction of everything, from being to beings. And so he views himself as like killing metaphysics, right? Yeah. Well, essence is a term of metaphysics, right? So he wants to get rid of essence. But you have a problem, because the moment you get rid of essence and you're like, there is no essence of tree, then why shouldn't a tree be turned into lumber? And that's a point that Thomas Jockin has brought out, because he's great and he's a super genius. I really love Thomas Jockin. So he was talking about that. It seems like the later Heidegger is like, I'm going to make being have the function of the essence. So the disclosure of the grapes as wine, in the very disclosure, is an experience of they should be that. They ought to be that because they're somehow aligned with essence. So it's like the disclosure of the thing phenomenologically is the essence. Which seems like being is like that, this mixture where being is more fundamental than essence for Heidegger, right? I mean, like the disclosure of being is essence, coming forth, but it's not essence separated from act. Like in Aristotle, there's, substance, accident and essence. And these are all different and yet the same and all that different stuff. Heidegger's like, no, the essence is the disclosure of the being when the thing comes forth as itself. Okay. Yeah. That is essence. So essence becomes much more phenomenological.
Right? And it's revealing itself to me in this phenomenon. That's the being. And it's this,
and so it would seem as if wine, like when the grapes are wine, somehow wine is a successful disclosure of the essence of the grapes as wine.
Because then it shows that it's not that grapes reveal themselves to me as like a being, disclosed, but that in its disclosure, it has this, I use the term transubstantiation, but this metabolic process of revealing itself in a multifaceted way. Maybe we could add Hegel into, because I got a copy of this commentary of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit by a guy named John Stewart, and he talks about how we have to understand the Kantian background of Hegel to understand his work on Phenomenology of Spirit, and that in the antinomies of Kant, he's only seeing objective determination in this abstract form, which is very limited, which is why he can't get past antinomies, because he only sees them as stagnant. He doesn't see them as a movement, and how Hegel has objective determination of seeing things not just in this abstract form and isolated from just the subject and the faculties of its understanding in space and time and the phenomenal and what it can't know, which is the thing in itself, but that there is a sort of activity towards the thing of itself that makes the subject move its location in a historical process in which it does, and this is where we get not only as substance, but as subject type thing, in that it's not just a pure abstract objective determination, but there's also this historical movement and of thought that allows me to get to a sublated position of these contradictions. And maybe thinking about it now, maybe it's not the case that Heidegger is thinking that, but we see a movement of where being manifests itself in a process of not just being grapes, but also being transformed into wine, being transformed into jelly,
excellent,
so forth, right? Grape juice.
excellent.
Yeah.
No, what you're getting at is big. So a few things. So what's interesting, so there's like, for me, a screaming question. Okay, why isn't wine the same as lumber? For some reason, lumber is reducing a tree to standing reserve, and yet wine is not. I mean, he speaks, what's very interesting too is for him, wine is not only a bringing forth of the grape, but also the jug, also earth, also sky, like the entire world in which wine is situated is actually brought out by wine. This is why he's talking about being, not beings, right? Because the wine brings out the jugness of the jug, which brings out the sky of the skyness. He gets very poetic in different things, but it's like this network of relations that
which is totally, because I think the only way wine could be lumber is if we take this Deleuzian Guattarian approach of rhizomatic, in which all things are just assemblaging to be just a sort of materialist monism, in which it's just a flat ontology. It's just everything's the same. It's all like univocal for the most part. And I don't think Heidegger's really about that. He realizes that there is this manifestation of relations, that one thing brings out the other thing in a certain set. As you said, the wine brings out the jugness of the jug, etc. But it's not like this sort of flat ontology in which all things are pretty much the same. We're just focused on the object.
And after going through this, I'm trying to get when Michelle and I were trying to get Belonging Again part 1 out, but then I'm like, I want to take Whitehead and Heidegger together, and then I'm like, no, Daniel, stop, finish what you started. It's this terrible habit, because I think there would actually be a lot on this notion and bringing it into a Whitehead and then a Bergson and all these different things. So to up the ante, it would also see in Heidegger that there's a difference between the wine that is a result of the farmer going and picking the grapes and doing the process by hand, and the wine of which comes off an assembly line. So then the question is what's the difference between wine 1 and wine 2? Heidegger seems to think there's a difference. And I think that starts to get at it, because then it's the same. Let's say it tastes exactly the same. Let's say it has the same color, and let's say wine 1 and wine 2, and if you put them on a table, you couldn't tell the difference. For Heidegger, there is a difference, even if it is. But this, for me, is critical because it means the difference is not in the facticity. There is something in the process that is inseparable from the phenomenon that then changes what it is in its being.
Is this where we would get into, like to evoke Deleuze's name, this is where we get into repetition, right? In which there's something that's repetitive doesn't always mean it's the same thing.
No, it is. In this, actually, that's very good, because what I was going to say is that notion of the repetition having a negation of the repetition in of itself also is the strangeness of absolute knowing for Zizek. So, this is what seems critical, and this is why I like to talk about the absolute choice regarding Hegel. So if you have those two wines, and I come up to you and I say, hey, this wine was done by a farmer. This wine was done off an assembly line. They taste exactly the same. They have the exact same price and everything. The Hegelian would say, I cannot see the difference, and yet I choose for there to be a difference. I am limited by the noumenon per se. I am limited from seeing the difference, and yet I believe there is a difference. And thus there is a difference, actually. And when I try to combine Heidegger and Hegel together, this is where it starts to make a lot of sense. Because Heidegger seems to be suggesting that the difference between, I think it may parallel tool and technology as well, because there's a distinction there, but I'm not as confident of that. That's one of those things it seems to be the same difference, but I put a little like asterisk by that because I'm not sure. But the difference between wine and lumber, to see why it brings Heidegger and Hegel together, seems to be the difference between wine 1 and wine 2, where the difference, you are limited from experiencing the difference, and yet precisely because of that limitation, you have the ability to choose that difference, and thus choose how you're limited, and thus choose for there to be a different disclosure of being between the wine of which is made by hand and the wine that's made by the assembly line, right? And and here's the key, by choosing to even believe that difference is possible in reality, you then carry yourself in the world as a different kind of person. You then carry yourself in the world as someone who believes that there are differences that cannot be reduced to facticity, because that's what you're doing in that moment. You're saying that there is a difference between those wines that cannot be found in the facticity, the phenomenon of the wine itself, that is part of its relation to the entire process. Well, the whole world is different now. The entire world is a place of which phenomenon consists of a layer that is not found in the phenomenon itself. Okay? And that would be AB. I like to talk about AB. And that seems to be what Heidegger is screaming at us to live like, that there is that difference there. And that would be, I think that aligns with Hegel's absolute knowing.
Right. And it makes me think, well, and then when we bring in someone like Marx and his Hegelian inversion with capital and bringing the dialectic, it's like, well, then how did the two different wines change when they become a product of the movement of capital and the commodity? Yes. And the commodity is the inversion of value, and that it's not you just got one commodity, but then the commodity has to relate to not as commodity A, but it needs a commodity B, and then you get B, C, D, etc. But they can only reflect back as the value is inverted by misrecognizing itself in commodity A. And the only way it could do that is with the universal equivalent, which is going to be money, which becomes the commodity itself in becoming the universal equivalent for all commodities. Like that right there would change its nature based on its valuation, it seemed like. And I want to know what you would think about that and how that fits in what you were just describing with Heidegger and Hegel.
This is very good. So a few things. The other thing I was going to say earlier before I forget, I think a wonderful paper that someone has probably written that I don't know about would be a Lacanian reading of Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, because The Sound and the Fury has where Quentin's committing incest, the fall of Caddy is the obstacle that you cannot reach. Like Faulkner is full to the brim with Lacan, even if he himself does not know it. And you could actually bring that out. So I was actually thinking that as you were speaking earlier, and I didn't say it. I actually think a lot of Faulkner is a particularly useful literary figure. You could even bring in Christmas from Lights in August and so on and so forth. But anyway, Absalon is another example. Well, that would be really good for mythos construction, narrative anyway. Anyway, to what you were saying. So what ends up happening in Marx, basically, with the role of money and commoditization, is that the possibility of choosing to say that wine is different from that wine is gone. There is no possibility to do that because the world is reduced to an ontology of A is A only. Like the phenomenon is the phenomenon. In what capitalism does is train you to think that you don't have the power to tell the difference between wine 1 and wine 2 if in their facticity they are the same. If the commodities are the same, and the point of the commodification of everything is basically to make everything the same, then what capitalism also does is say, if everything is the same, then you have no ability to change it, right? Where if you follow Heidegger or Hegel, no, you as the subject always have the power to say there's a difference between the wine made by hand and the wine that's made off the conveyor belt, right? Because you believe that there's something about the disclosure of the being of the wine that was brought about by hand, that even if you cannot detect it, you believe it is there, and therefore you as the individual subject always have a kind of power. Because you can always choose that there's something to the phenomenon that kind of transcends the process of commodification, right? There's always a B that is outside of capture in a way, right?
Right. And this is where, because like the one thing about like, obviously when we get into like capitalist critique and stuff like that, when it comes from Marx, we get ideology, and then Althusser talks about interpolation. So, but what Zizek brings about is that interpolation is not always successful, that because of the symbolic order is not complete, that there is the gap. And so failed interpolation happens because we're not entirely whole symbolic subjects. And therefore we get his, not only him, but someone like Matthew Fleecefader, he uses this, he coins this term in his book on the algorithms of desire. The hysteric is Freud's proletariat, in which they cannot enjoy or be fully interpolated. So therefore they're in this impasse in which there's not just the subject of ideology or of capitalism. It fails. And so in failed interpolation, we get the emergence of the barred subject of Lacan, in which tries to traverse its fantasy and tries to work through ideology. And maybe in that uses the Heideggerian choice to differentiate and try to see itself. And yet it also is orbiting around the position of the big other, constantly questioning this position, lacking an answer, and therefore always desiring more. And yet it gets undermined. And that's its object of desire is the knowledge, is the chain of knowledge, and how the master says, oh, this is how you enjoy. And yet it fails to do that because it can never get that. But the point is to always overthrow the master, right? But yet there's this chance to where Lacan says, like, you after May 68, like, you all want a master. Don't worry, you're going to get one, to the failed revolutionaries, because that's exactly what they wanted. They didn't want to change. They just wanted a new master. But we see as the hysteric going inside the domain of the master to question, right? Going inside ideology and making that differentiation, it seems like.
Well, this is really important because it's the weirdness. It's the weirdness of Kojève, the master-slave dialect in Hegel, right?
Yeah.
What's so strange is that Hegel is telling you that the slave is the master, but the slave can only be the master as a slave.
Yes.
So this is really weird. Like you can only be a master in a slave structure, basically, because there has to be the dependency of the master on you, which means you have the power, but only because you're a slave.
Yes, so, and because the master is dead, right? That's the main thing, and Lacan mentions that is that the slave is really trying to evoke a dead master, and yet doesn't know that the master is dead. The Nietzschean God is dead, but really it's the fact that they don't know that God is dead. So therefore, God is of the unconscious. The dead master becomes the discourse of the unconscious for the neurotic structure, as Lacan would bring out. But yeah, that is important. It's like they really only could be masters as so long as they're in the slave structure. That's actually really interesting.
Well, because what that would mean is that the only way to overcome ideology is in ideology, because you're a slave of the ideological structure, right? But it's precisely because you are there that then there is the possibility of saying, oh, by the way, I can choose the B. I can choose that this wine is different. But I have to be situated in a structure of which I am the slave, right? But then I have the ability of going, oh, I have the power to say that this wine made by hand is different from the wine that is made by the conveyor belt, right? So the overthrow of ideology is only possible within ideology.
Right.
Which is this weird thing. This is where we've made mistakes, because what we like, this to me is the revolutionary character of, if I'm thinking Hegel and Heidegger, this later Heidegger and the Sifter Slate, like there's been a lot of effort to overcome ideology by leaving ideology. Right? Mm-hmm. But then you can't have the true power, because you can't be the slave who has the power over the master, right? Likewise, if you didn't have, like, let's say, like, you've got all these people, it's like, oh, we want to overcome the subconscious, or we want to like gain control over it, or different things, right? Well, then you would not have a subconscious that had a mastery over you that then you could have power over and being a slave to it, right? So the thing is, you have to be situated within the ideological structure to then have the possibility of unveiling the power of saying B. This wine is different from this, AB versus AA. As you know, that's the language I like to use, right?
Yeah.
So you have to be situated within AA in order to have the power to say AB and it be revolutionary. Like if you're actually outside of AA, if you're outside the ideology, then you're just BB. You're just a different form of AA, actually. To be AB, it has to occur within the ideological structure. In order to be a true master, you have to be a slave under a master who's actually the dead, right? To change. So this is where the ability to tell the difference between wine and lumber, or wine 1 and wine 2, is the revolutionary character, of which is the act of absolute knowing, of which Heidegger seems to be pointing to. And this is what's interesting to me. That seems to be the ability to be in a cipher as opposed to the basketball game, to go to the earlier example, right? Like in the basketball game, you are structured by what's going on and you'll be carrying along. But because you're in the basketball game, it's possible to say, I'm going to bring a second basketball. I'm going to actually bring in or introduce something to it that can disrupt it. Now, the problem with that sort of disruption, though, is you may actually be invoking a second basketball, but actually the ideological structure, you're still using a basketball. So it's not entirely new. So even that kind of revolutionary character could actually just be re-sucked in.
Right.
Things.
But even in thinking about it now, like just the as you mentioned, that capital seems to have this tautological reflecting of like A is A and B is something different, but like isn't that also the contradiction of not just capital but just of identity itself, even in Hegel? Because like if A is A, you don't even need to say that, or A equals A, you just need to say A. But why would you need to again overemphasize the equivalence to itself if it already is not what it is?
100%,
right?
100%.
So just to say that is like A equals A, that second A is not the same as the first A. Absolutely. And so therefore we have a split already. And as Zizek talks about this in They Know Not What They Do on his chapter, the one, he talks about the logic of the signifier or the sign, and that when we look at Lacan's mirror stage, we see something similar, in which that when we look at the imaginary and the symbolic, these are not two separate entities, right? One of imaginary identification and the ego, and then one of language and signifiers and the symbolic structure. Rather, the image, the imaginary, what the thing about an image is that for Lacan, it's a reflection. It's like a mirror. It's reflected. So the image has to internally reflect upon itself to understand itself. And in this double reflection, what happens is that there is this hooking onto the symbolic order, which creates a virtual point. And so there is not only a reflection, but also an inversion. And so therefore, that itself is self-defeating to try to relate to itself, because it's not relating to itself at all. It's relating to a virtual image, which then continues to relate and thus creates the symbolic order of signification, because with reflection comes thinking, and thinking comes language.
Absolutely.
So, therefore, we're hooking onto a virtual focal point that produces different signifiers to replace another signifier to understand what was the first, the subject, but the subject can only know itself if it reflects upon itself. So A can only know itself by reflecting, but that reflecting already inverts its own being.
Oh, brilliant. It's so critical. Exactly what you say, like in the paper on A is A, like the moment you say A, That's it, right? But it's just like you have to go, but A is A.
Yeah.
It can never mean that. And like if you say if you took the formula A equals A, why not say A equals A equals A equals A equals A? Why not go on forever, right?
Yeah.
Or why not reverse it to A and then shrink it down more and more, right? It's an eternal regression equals an eternal regression. Like it either goes in forever or it expands forever. And Mr. Ebert, the great Mr. Ebert, will talk about like kind of a wavelength structure where it either kind of goes or it compresses and different things. And that's very important. What's so radical is basically what we're talking like you choose if the image in the mirror is you or not. Just like you choose if the wine 1 and wine 2 are different, right? They look exactly the same and different, but you're choosing, no, there actually is some sort of disclosure of being that is different in wine 1 versus wine 2, right? Mm-hmm. Well, likewise, there seems to be a step where one day you go, so you don't have a mirror, then you have a mirror stage, oh, that's me, or something. But then one day, there's almost like a second stage, as you know, where you go, no, actually, that isn't me. That's just an image. Well, now you have made a choice by which to understand what that is, right? Well, right there is a pretty revolutionary step because you are basically saying that no representation can capture you, right? Yeah. Like no representation is you, right? Mm-hmm. So what you are is always outside of representation, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that means no structure can capture you. There's always a certain leakage, right?
Right, and this is where we get into the unconscious for Lacan, that the subject is within the unconscious, the barred subject, and in its manifestation in the mirror stage is a misrecognized form, and it takes itself to be the ego. And yet the ego itself is also a mirror image in which it reflects upon an other. So therefore, not only we got language, but this constant like resistance towards knowing the repression of the unconscious subject, which makes it even more difficult. Because for Lacan, it's like the unconscious is no negation. It only knows affirmation. It's only like on these layers of the ego that negation happens, right? And we get in like to Verneinung and Freud on negation, where he talks about the Wolfman dream. The Wolfman's in analysis, like, I had a dream about a woman, but I could assure you that this woman is not my woman, right? You know, like right then and there.
Right.
But
like, don't worry.
Yeah. But, you know, obviously the unconscious brought upon the affirmation of a woman, but it's only that the ego of the Wolfman had to bring about like a resistance to saying, like, I assure you that that's not my mother, right? So therefore, it's like there's a subject of enunciation which speaks upon the enunciated, right?
No, well, what's so interesting, it's very interesting to me, because what is the difference between, if we just use the metaphoric structure that I'm forcing you to indulge me in this evening on basketball versus cipher, lumber versus wine. Okay, I'll go back to the lumber and wine because it's difficult to say wine 1 and wine 2, but you get the point. Okay, so in a cipher or in the wine 2, for Heidegger, something is enunciating, but it is not something that is concealing. Like, it's like something comes forth. So it's like in Heidegger, you have clearing, being comes forth, right? In Lacan, there is something trying, it's almost like being's trying to come out and then it's concealed, right? Like so it's interesting where there's some sort of like in Heidegger, it's like you've got to do the work to meet the conditions of a clearing by which then being can come forth, right? So with the wine, like you've got to do the work to be the kind of subject that can realize the essence of, the essence of the grapes into wine. So there's some sort of work of the subject you got to do that. And then it ends with a certain announcement, a certain disclosure, because it's interesting to compare disclosure and enunciation, like you're saying. Like, so in Heidegger, there's like, at the end of it is a certain disclosure of something that is irreducible to you, right? Which then precisely unveils the failure of representation. Because if you try to represent it, you're going to turn capital B being into lowercase b being, right? Like Heidegger has basically been warning, like we've lost the question of being because we've been representing being in terms of beings, and as a result, we've lost it all. Now, that's not exactly his language, but that's a way to language it. Right. So you're trying to close representation, and that would be the being with the slash through it. So there's a conditioning for a clearing so that there can be a being with the slash through it. Okay, so disclosure. In Lacan, it's as if there is something that is trying to conceal itself in the announcement. It's like, what's the difference and now I'm just thinking live, like it would be very interesting to trace out the difference between announcement and disclosure, and to kind of use what you're saying, like the announcement.
Right. Well, I think for disclosure, it's purely phenomenological, right? And not to say that there isn't a phenomenological component to the speech in which there is a subject of enunciation, but what is concealed in I guess, can't be seen or witnessed phenomenologically in the Heideggerian sense is what is going on in the unconscious. Desire and jouissance, the drive, that which is absent. So there is always an absence which is being presented on the phenomenological aspect. The real is what is resisting language, not just speech, but language, which is something that takes a life of its own. Because he wants to make a key thing in not only Seminar 1, but also Function and Field, right. His early essay in 1953, that speech is phenomenological, but language is structural. And yet somehow there is an absence to the deadlocks of the structure. Right. And drive, that drive, libido, the death instinct itself is something that is always absent within the repetition, you know, and can only become known within this working through, as you said earlier, working through ideology, working through, you know, all this stuff, working through the fantasy, working through this repetition compulsion can only be revealed in a sort of misrecognized form at first, but then it starts to get to the point of retroactivity and absolute knowing in so far as the analyst positions themselves as the object cause of desire for the analyst, for the transference. This is something that's crucial in Seminar 11, as he says that, well, objet A is the grounds for transference, making the analysand believe that the analyst is a subject supposed to know. The repetition of the unconscious and the drive, which the drive is the third concept. And then the fourth is actually the concept of the unconscious, which appears outside of ourselves and not something that is in this cauldron of archetypes and primal energies or affects, or this internal dimension in which other forms of psychoanalytic thinking like to think. It's that, no, the unconscious is outside of us. And when we see it in the transfers, it escapes us. It announces itself, because speech and language are not this communicative verbal thing of trying to relate meaning, but evoke something. I said it yesterday in the discussion. I don't know if you caught the part with Nick about how we should see the big other in locating ourselves in the discourse like an improv show in which Zizek brings this metaphor up in Sublime or Perfect Guide to Ideology, the film, that it operates like this. The actors have no script. The only thing they have is an earpiece, and they listen to the director as they guide them through this thing. And the what the director does is makes the actor reflect within themselves to bring out their potential and the best for the show. In the same way that the big other situates us to always look within, and this is also mediation of the superego, to constantly bring out how do I enjoy? What do I desire? And so the analyst acts as this mirror, or this certain symbolic position that displaces mastery and yet constantly allows the subject to repeat itself by projecting out the fantasy, or to reveal the object cause of desire, which will bring about this repetition compulsion, the death drive. And the death drive is not something that's just purely destructive. There is a learning mechanism to it, which is something that Lacan brings out that's revolutionary compared to Freud. And I say this joke many times, and I freaking love this joke. This is something that he says in Seminar 2, but he says that that there's an error, or a truth from error, that happens in the death drive, and it learns from this insistence of wanting to learn so far as it places itself in a position of ignorance and knowing that it's ignorant. And so the joke is like an idiot boy comes to a funeral after not seeing a family for so long, and he says, "Many happy returns," and they all yell at him and beat him up and saying, "You're not supposed to say that. You're at a funeral. You're supposed to say, 'May God rest his soul.'" And so 2 weeks later, he goes to a wedding, and as they're saying their vows, he says, "May God rest his soul." And so he gets beat up again. That is the learning that comes from repetition compulsion.
Oh my gosh. Now I really want to do the Lacan Sound and the Fury, because Benji confuses a wedding and a funeral veil, and he's the idiot boy. Oh my gosh. Oh, it's screaming a Faulkner analysis. That joke is freaking funny. So a few things. And again, the work that you, Mikey, your readings are just extraordinary. Dave, Nick. You know, Nick and you and Nick, I just find inspiring how you've been going through these texts bit by bit. And he's hilarious. Nick did the video recently where he was at the table and he's like meaning, and he's like, "I just wanted to call you in to tell you that I laughed so hard." Oh, I laughed. Yeah,
that was so good.
That was so funny. No, I really, and actually stuff like that can do a lot to communicate a lot more than, say, a philosophical argument very quickly. Even if you need the philosophy to get to the place to do a work like that, I just thought, well, Nick, I was just marvelous. Just the entire Young Zizekians is marvelous. So again, I just want to emphasize that. I'm really, so a few things that are very interesting to me. So Heidegger, the later Heidegger gets very interested in poetry. And poetry is some sort of like closing of the gap almost between the signifier and the signified. It's where, and it's bringing to mind, and I appreciate also your willingness to go through all these different languages. I think what's interesting, like I was talking to Michelle about this. One of the challenges of these internet, well, one of the skills that I think is going to be very important on these internet conversations is the meta-language ability, which is the ability to jump in and out of language structures and to overlay them on different thinkers. And I actually think that's one of the things that these internet conversations can do that traditional academia could not do, because they were all specialized and they were all in their language game. But this ability, like the ability to cross-pollinate and overlay language games, if you will, or language structures, is going to unveil. I think it's going to bring out a lot, and I think it's the meta. I've just been calling it the meta language skill, because you're able to jump. I think that's so important. So what's interesting, like when I think about poetry and Heidegger, it makes me think of what Samuel Beckett said about Joyce in Finnegan's Wake. And Beckett was like, he said, Joyce wants the word water to be water. He wants the word water to drip. And he said, like, he wants the word dance to be dancing, is what he's trying to do in Finnegan's Wake. Seems to be what's going on in poetry. And that would almost seem to be closing speech and language, where like speech somehow, the phenomenal, like the structure of language, of which tends to dominate speech or not allow the phenomenology of speech to come out, actually then structures the phenomenology and then has a full disclosure of being, right? Because it's almost like when speech and language are divided, in the same way that we were saying, like you need ideology to be to actually have power, to be the slave that actually is the master. If you didn't have structure, it wouldn't be possible to condition yourself to the place where you could have language strike you, because you couldn't even define words, right? Like if we use that, like if words didn't have definition, then poetry wouldn't be possible. And yet, weirdly enough, poetry that's merely the definitions of words suck. Right. So there's this weird thing going on where you need words to have structure, definition, so that you can then make words that are the thing in themselves, like in Joyce. Like Joyce needs the word water to have a definition so that he can then try to make a word water that drips. And of course,
and it's like, well, I know Lacan uses Joyce in his later seminar to talk about syntome and psychosis, but it's like he doesn't just want a signifier and something that could be signified, but he wants it to literally be the appearance of water, or to be almost like water itself, and to where you get into this like switching of signs. It's like you can't tell what it is. Like I think for Lacan, you would say like this is like the sort of psychosis of Joyce, in which he doesn't want to have a structure, but he just wants it to be the thing. It's like, I don't just say water, but I experience the dripping of water or the pouring of water, like not even say like a faucet. It's a faucet that's hitting me. That's where he says like psychotics can't be poets type thing.
Something I've wanted to write that I've had, I almost want to compare Joyce with the schizoanalysis of Deleuze. Like, I don't think they're the same. Like what Deleuze is doing with the schizoanalysis or the schizopolitics for the destabilization of associational thinking, Joyce is obviously very associational, but it seems like what Joyce's project is something of making the word water drip. As opposed to in Deleuze, the name of the game is to uncouple the word water from dripping, like make water burn. Almost like Deleuze.
So it's funny because it makes me think. All right, so I'm not a Joyce scholar at all.
No one is. Actually, unless you do it for 50 years, you're not. It's like Harold Bloom's dead, so we're all just people.
Nick is a big Joyce fan, and something that Lacan sees Joyce kind of creating a whole name of the father himself within his own writings and trying to create like a language that could allow him to function and like heal himself for the most part. But he wants to make water drip. Whereas you could see Deleuze uncoupling that, and instead of making water not drip, he wants to make the term drip. And you know how like we have this Gen Z slang, it's like if you're dressing nice, you have drip. You have drip. So that's Deleuzian, right?
That's good. Yes. I think that's a good, and they don't seem to be the same strategy. I don't, and I don't want to say there's no value, because I'm always hesitant. Like I never feel like I always feel like I need to read Deleuze the whole canon 4 more times before I'm too hard or anything. And obviously, a Deleuzian metaphysics and ontology can fit extremely well in a Hegelian framework, right? But there's some sort of difference here. Well, the way I put it is that Deleuze will deal with the problem of totalitarianism if we go politics, but at the expense of shared intelligibility necessary for relations, right? Mm-hmm. So that strategy works, but it can lead to atomization and splitting apart, right? Whereas, like, looking at Joyce's strategy, where you're trying to make water drip, seems to be like, like, it's funny because when I say water drips. And yet when I say the word water drips, it's like, oh, so there's an intelligibility, but also a meaning that is not reducible to that intelligibility. And that right there seems to be a Deleuzian that doesn't atomize. Like we still have a shared intelligibility, but we're also not bound to the original understanding of it, right? Well, that too seems to be what is kind of the effort of Heidegger when he talks about poetry. Because when he's talking about the disclosure of being, I say being to you, and if you have any philosophy training whatsoever, you know what the word being then, but Heidegger's like, no, but it's not that. But the moment I say water drips, you're like, oh, I know water. No. I mean the word water drips, right? So there's a, I'm going to give you being, but I'm going to put a slash through it. I'm going to tell you water drips, but I'm talking about the word, right? So there's a certain Deleuzian spin there, but at a shared intelligibility, okay? So you have the realm of relation. And so if Heidegger, and then what's interesting is it seems that whatever this is attempting, whatever this is getting at, this Heideggerian Joycean strategy, is the strategy in terms of language, speech, whatever we want to, that is somehow escaping the negatives in Lacan of ideology. All of this seems to be how you as a subject try to step outside the big other in this way and yet not escape the big other. Because it seems like you're like, oh, we're going to just like escape the big other. That's just what the big other wants you to think.
Exactly.
Like, as soon as you do it, it's got you. So you're like,
that's exactly why. And like Deleuze and Guattari's like notion of like deterritorialization and becoming a body without organs, although it seems very like liberatory, it's like, we got to get away from the despotic signifier. It's like, well, capitalism as a discourse wants you to do that because now you could assemble onto things, because the one thing about assemblage theory and their understanding of libido is that it's not sublimating, it's not lacking, it is breaking down the structure to assemble and couple on into this machinic process. So libido for them has an immediate, imminent certainty of what it wants to latch onto. But for Lacan, it's like, no, libido is not certain on what it wants. Libido undermines itself. Drive undermines itself.
Right.
If you have a drive that is certain on its enjoyment, well, now we're talking about a structure of perversion in which it is fine with the structure right there, as long as it has the ability to enjoy, whether it's in a cruel or masochistic way, it's going to get what it wants because it is not duped or believes it's not duped and avoids castration. So
Yes.
that is where you see or sort of schizoanalytic project lead to a perversion of capitalism and a reification of it.
Oh, what's so interesting is like the big other's got you if you let it be other, and when you're escaping it, you're like, oh, now it's other because it's
because they think there's there is this like non-barred thing that they can couple onto, like something that isn't barred, in this positive movement and process.
Well, that's completely right. Like the big other couldn't capture you if you didn't think you weren't captured. Right. The moment you're like, I'm captured by the big other, then you would try to get away or something, or you change or whatever. So there has to be I always, another thinker that I'm always like, I need to go back and reread and write on, but I haven't learned how to stop time. You let me know. I thought children would help. For some reason, they speed it up. It's weird. I thought I would give them all the labor, right? I was like, now I've learned capitalism. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. They just run around with their underwear on the porch. It's like, okay, hey, that's the schizo strategy, actually. But I always like Baudrillard. And the reason I like
Baudrillard's nice, yeah, Baudrillard's nice.
The death of the real also removes the ability to say the real died. Right? Like when you have the death of the real, then also you're not even able to say that reality died. So there's a negation of the negation, if you will, that then makes it seem as if this inability to tell the difference between digital and analog has always been the case, right? And so likewise, I always find very interesting that like when people do selfies, they'll go selfie like with a joke way. And because of that ironic distancing, they're not just another one of those people taking selfies.
Right. Yeah. And something that Baudrillard says in I think he says it elsewhere too, but I know he says it in like his obviously infamous simulacrum and simulation work that adults go to Disneyland and it's like this space.
It's a hyper real. Yeah.
They're children to forget the fact that the ideology and hyper reality that they're living isn't childish.
Isn't that right?
It's actually more childish like than going to Disneyland.
Oh yeah. Well, and the key with that is like the discourse has captured you precisely because you think that you're not part of the discourse, right? Like it's okay for me to take a selfie as long as I do it ironically. Right? Like it's okay for me to basically on the weekend be just a capitalist consumer as long as I talk about the dangers of capitalism, right?
Right.
And so likewise,
a paper straw for your, iced coffee.
Then it's okay. Yeah, Zizek's good on that, right? It's just really funny. Well, so what's interesting in this? So here's the question: like, it's almost like also there's the risk though of discussing the big other, making you think that you're not part of the big other, right? Like if we talk about Lacan and we read Lacan, that means we've followed Lacan and we're not falling into these things. And it's almost like, this is where I'm interested in, because it's almost like in Heidegger, it's like the even knowing about the big other will not necessarily make you overcome the ways that it can trick you, et cetera, and so forth, unless you are engaging in this kind of ability to make water drip, to make being disclose itself. And this is, now I'm like stacking all the different language levels on top of one another, but there's something in Heidegger and Hegel, which is basically saying you can talk about the big other all day long, but if you never make the choice to say this wine is not the same as that wine, that there is something about this that is the disclosure of being that is different from this. And then I wonder, so it was evoke and announce, right? Where this kind of, it's almost like the announcement, oh, this is not my mother, is the temptation of you to, it's almost like that's when your subconscious is trying to hide from you the fact that you have the ability to see a difference between these two wines.
Right.
So it would come and say, no, it's just wine. Oh, it's not my mother. Oh, it's not my mother. Oh, no, they're just wine. They taste the same. What's the big deal, man? Because the moment you start going, no, I have the ability to choose that there is a difference between these two, that I'm limited from experience because I'm limited from experiencing my limit in Hegel, that means you're responsible for that ability. Yeah. And then you as a subject are responsible for yourself. And that's completely what the big other, like the big other exists to make you not responsible, right? Like you don't have to worry about yourself. The moment you have the ability to say that this phenomenon discloses being differently from this one, the big other is dead.
Yeah.
There's no big other now.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. No, that's the main thing. I mean, the big other has been dead. It's the fact that there's no big other. That's what Zizek and Lacan point out. And like, it's the reversal of the Dostoevsky. If God is dead, then all is permitted. It's like, no, the fact that God exists must be that all is permitted. And the fact that if we find out that the big other doesn't exist, whether it's in the form of whatever the ideology is or of God, you know, if they don't exist, then nothing is permitted. That's the main thing. And why there is this sort of perversion to having an unbarred big other for us to enjoy. Because this is the whole point that comes out in the logic of the capitalist discourse, is that the injunction to enjoy the superego in the misrecognized form of the big other says, enjoy. And so it's not this like, oh, you're immoral, you're wrong for enjoying, like, you know, you need to follow the categorical imperative. No, it's like, you need to enjoy, get it right. If you're not enjoying enough, get it right. Just get it right. And this is what Michael Downs always says, you know, Dangerous Navy. It's like, just get it right. That's all it is. It doesn't logically explain how you need to do it. It's just get it right. Just do it right. You're messing up. You need to enjoy. Enjoy better. Do it better. Just do it. Nike, just do it, right? That's the injunction to enjoy under the ideology of capitalism, and how there is this cruel perversion that of it, and it's that even though we don't get it, the enjoyment is the cruelty that we impose upon ourselves because we demand more of ourselves. We bring ourselves to the point where it's like we need to bring out our full potential, to be our whole selves. This is where therapy culture comes into it, the happy signifier of, you know, self-awareness, full potentiality. Don't put a language to it. Just be your authentic self. That is the happy, nice, passive-aggressive, perverse superego that comes out in that.
No, that's right.
It's a misrecognized big other.
Oh, it's magnificent. Well, if the human subject is fundamentally incomplete, then if I say get it right, you never get it right, and therefore you're always trying, therefore you're done, right? You're captured, right? Yeah. So like if I'm like, get it, like I love that language, enjoy better, enjoy. Okay, I'll go to the beach again. I'm ready.
Right. That's why Zizek loves Coca-Cola like as the perfect commodity, because what does it say on this? It's enjoy. And yet what leaves is the real component of it, in that, you know, you can only enjoy it cold, and so once it gets warm, all it is just flat excremental crap that we can't, you know, calculate into our symbolic order, because we only recognize Coca-Cola as this enjoy, and it should be signified to what should be like, you know, a nice cold pop that's carbonated and crisp, but as soon as it gets flatter and flatter, it's that excremental waste that is part of our jouissance, our real.
And that's when we make barbecue with it. Because it turns out that you can make really good barbecue with flat Coke. So
maybe the essence of the Coca-Cola is in its barbecue, right?
That's actually what it is. That's it all comes together. That's what it was. Now, when somebody told me that they made this barbecue with Coke, I was like, wow, this is late capitalism. So this is it. A few that, well, what you're getting at, it's like it's the strange concept in Hegel, where absolute knowing is the state where you realize what was always already, right?
Right, yeah.
You know, it's, I was talking with Dr. Philippe, who I adore, and it's the kind of idea that it's a journey to nowhere in Hegel. Like you go on this journey to be what you've always been and not realized, right? And that's actually what makes these discussions interesting, because whenever you talk about a big other, you're talking about something that is not there, but you have to go through a process to realize what's not there, right?
Yeah, like it's the virtual. It's a virtual.
Yes, it's a virtual. And it's a notion like in Hegel, and this is where I think you can start seeing being Heidegger with the slash through it. In Hegel, the journey has a slash through it. Mm-hmm. Like it is always a journey with a slash through it. And yet there's a difference between journey. For Hegel, journey is always basically going to be a spurious infinity. The no journey is bad because then you have an effacement. I call it the effacement, where it's just A is A relation. Because if you have no journey, then you're just going to be following the A is A self-relation, and that leads to an effacement as opposed to a negation sublation. Whereas the journey with the slash through it is the true infinity, because it's a circle that's relating into itself, relating into itself, relating into itself. And what's very interesting too about this is like if a line journey, so in Hegel, if a line goes on forever, it's spurious, and that's bad. But if a line journeys around and comes to the top, it becomes a circle, and then it's as if it never went on a journey. It's negated, sublated, and now it's just a circle. A circle is not a line that goes and connects to the other side. It's just a circle. So there's this weird thing where the journey with a slash through it in Hegel is, if you succeed in the journey, it's as if you never went on a journey, right? It like vanishes. So likewise, when like the journey of the big other, if you will, is a realization that it was never there. And then it's as if it was never there, because it never was there, right? Yeah. And this flip, I call it a flip moment. It's where it flips, like, and it changes what you were always doing. And that's an example where you actually can change the past, right? Like, you know, there's a transformation. And actually, philosophy doesn't think if it doesn't think flip moments. Like, basically, philosophy has followed a temporal structure that has been spurious, not a temporal structure that has been a true infinity in Hegel with a circle, if you will. And that is, there is something about absolute knowing that is a revelation of a new kind of time. I do think I'm going to be very dangerous and say I think it has something to do. It's very similar to Bergson's concept of time, which is crazy. Don't ask me anything about that. But like, Bergson's concept of time is bizarre and yet really convincing. Anyway, so in Hegel, like, absolute knowing is the point where the past changes. Like, what you were doing, you didn't know what you were doing, and then it turns out as if you were always doing that, and it's as if you were always doing that. And so once the line journeys and connects, it's always been a circle, and there's never been a journey. Likewise, once you realize the big other is always not, it's not there, then it's as if it was never there. And that's the tricky move but that almost is the bringing together of water with drip. Like to be able to talk about the big other as a thing that's not there in its there-ness. To be able to talk about the word water as if it is dripping. To be able to talk about the wine that is its facticity, but also not reducible to its facticity at the same time. I'm not saying these are all equivalent, but there's something about that, all of which is the ontoepistemology of AB as opposed to AA. And a lot of this sort of escaping ideology, which you never escape, but to be almost the slave master in the ideology as opposed to mastered by the ideology. It requires this AB thinking. It requires this ability to set the conditions of disclosure, as opposed to always be susceptible to the self-deception of announcement that's coming forth. And that's where, if we look at Heidegger as having something to do with some kind of almost skill, really, like some sort of skill of being able to create the conditions of evoking disclosure, then that, of which I also think Hegel's in the business in, and then the science of logic is basically, if the world is such a place where disclosure can occur, if a subject conditions itself accordingly, then what are the logical implications of that? What must be the logical underpinnings of reality so something like that can occur, right? Well, it can't be Aristotle. Not that Aristotle's wrong, it's just incomplete. Like, that's how I always put it. It's not that Aristotle is wrong, it's just incomplete. It overfits, right? And so all of that seems to be what you need in your tool belt, if you will, or your worldview, or your framework, so that you are not falling into these various pathologically problematic ways of life that are constantly being described by Lacan, constantly being seen as one is under ideology. And so there seems to be relation there.
And the thing about time, at least for Lacan, is like not only just the logical time, but that what's interesting about repression is that repression is always the return of the repressed, and it returns from the future. So as you move forward in that, therefore you're able to realize that as it is enacted out in analysis and the transference, and therefore you could change the past. Because the one thing about the truth of analysis is also the truth of the subject. And so far, as he says in Seminar 1, insofar that it is able to historicize the subject, like historicize the past, but as it moves forward in the future. So there's constant retroactivity of how the future movement of repression is able to change the sequence of the fantasy of the past, it seems like. like his student Leclerc, he talks about this, and I read, it's like in this anthology that Zizek edited. It's on psychoanalysis, and Serge Leclerc is one of his students. It's like fragments from psychoanalytic discourse in clinic, and he talks about a specific patient who has this dream about like a unicorn or something like that, and he's like walking through the forest, and the unicorn is drinking something. Pretty much what these different terms in French that has to do with drink align with this name Lily and pour, and so there's this different like switching of signifiers. The dream doesn't really matter at this point. It's more of how the signifiers operate with how the verbiage is used. And a play on words happens to create a condensation. And the condensation is pretty much a bunch of different idealizations and signs that create, oh, this is the nucleus of what's happening in, I guess, for lack of a better term, the unconscious and repression, condensation. And so the condensation manifests in a word that comes out in the clinic for Leclerc for this patient, and the word is called pour jelly.
Pour jelly.
Jelly is something that acts as a trace for him to admit into the symbolic order of the unconscious, to realize that there's some sort of unconscious repression towards his interaction with his mother, the patient's mother. And so, and therefore, we see this dream manifest. And what is hidden in this condensation is that these signifiers are constantly playing on a word. So like fragments of pour jelly, the lily, the gel, and pour are played on in different signs, but they make a condensation in this focal point that is not being revealed for the subject.
That's really good. So there's something about the pour jelly. Now, first off, I had a flash of that Tom Cruise movie, Legend, with the devil creature with the unicorn
as you were speaking. And I then also had an image of candy corn, which at Halloween is candy corn with little horns out of it.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be the ultimate trick. So, the ultimate trick of treat, or different things. Maybe there's a budding market here. I don't know. So with the porna jelly, I think I said porna jelly. I don't think that's a genre. Pori jelly. I might say porna jelly. So hard to say. That maybe that's a slip of the tongue. I don't know.
That's like a witticism, kind of like a fat millionaire, or familiar.
Familiar. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So there's something in that pour jelly that is a concealing and a revealing. Because it's revealing the coming together of these images into something that then points to something that's being repressed. If I understand that correctly. So what's interesting is when I look at Heidegger, there definitely is almost an analysis of Western philosophy as being that. Like a condensing into a pour jelly of kind of going, God is dead, because for him, Nietzsche is kind of the end of Western philosophy. And it's like, no, hold on. The God is dead is actually unveiling something that you are repressing. Oh, you've been hiding the question of being. Oh, that's funny. Oh, and the question of being you've defined as beings, not being, because beings give you power over, and being would be something that is disclosed to you, right? So there's something about what's very interesting here, and Heidegger also, of course, with the clearing language, which is that Greek word in A I can't say, where whenever something is unveiled, it's also hidden, right? Like Heidegger has that whole kind of structure. Like when the bookcase appears to you, it's hiding the atoms, right? Everything is simultaneously concealing and revealing, right? Like the veil unveils that there's something worth seeing, maybe, or at least tempting you, right? And so likewise, the way that the psyche seems to, the way that the consciousness tends to operate is whenever it's showing you something, it's only showing you that thing in order to hide something, right? But then the subject of which knows that is different from the subject who doesn't know that, right? So then there's like, it's almost like you have these steps where it's like, you got Western philosophy. So if I'm following a Heideggerian schema, you have the Western subject who doesn't know that they are in fact hiding something from themselves. Then you have the early Heidegger, which is the realization that the subject is hiding something from itself. And then the later Heidegger is, what does the subject need to do to get out of its way so that that thing being hidden can come forth, right? And so, whereas it's almost like, again, I'm just overlaying things, and I've kept you for an hour and 30 minutes because this has been a blast. I've had a really fun time. Really so I really appreciate it. And it's almost like in Lacan, it's like a realization of this mechanism of concealment that is occurring, that if you don't recognize, then you're going to fall into the big other, right? That's, you're going to fall into the ideological system, right? So then Heidegger is like, okay, how do we condition philosophy? For him, it's going to be philosophy, phenomenology even, to let come forth the thing that has been concealing. So there had to be 3 steps. 1, the process of concealing. 2, the recognition that there was a concealment that was hiding something. And then 3, figuring out the conditioning so the thing concealed can come forth, right? That, although he's talking about phenomenology, that also is almost a training ground of the subject. Like you in your own life should learn how to do that. And actually, if you in your own life learned how to do that, that would go a long way to having you have the right relation to ideology.
Right.
Because you can never escape ideology, but you can relate to ideology differently, right? In a manner that you're the slave who's the master, because you realize that you have the power, right? In the way that we were saying earlier.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that sounds about right. And one thing about in realizing that there was a concealment and that the thing being concealed reveals itself to you, for at least like psychoanalysis, what's being revealed that was concealed is that there was nothing to begin with, right? That's what brings about an inherent anxiety, is that lack. And what keeps us from realizing that, or maybe even disavowing that, is by maintaining enjoyment and fixation on the veil that conceals itself. And so that's what we got to be worried about. And the fact that it's like there is no big other, and the fact that what's being revealed and disclosed to us from concealment is the lack of an other, the lack of the phallus, just ontological lack in itself. And so that's the whole working through. So I would just add that, something that's nothing, or as you just says, a less than nothing.
Yeah. Well, what seems so it's almost so like in Hegel, there's if you start with an empty hand and then you pick up a pen and then you drop it, it's a different empty hand than if you started never having picked up the pen, right? And as Zizek will talk about the coffee that doesn't have,
coffee without milk or creamer.
Yeah. There's a difference, right? Well, in Hegel, it's a weird thing of the bit. In Hegel, it's like you never see the pen picked up to be dropped, and yet you choose, because you're limited from experiencing the pen being dropped, you choose to believe that this empty hand is an empty hand after holding a pen versus an empty hand that never held a pen, okay? Right, yeah. But you're limited from ever seeing the experience of picking up the pen, okay? So it's a choice to believe that this empty hand is after picking up a pen versus never picking up a pen. Okay, right. So imagine that the pen didn't exist and I picked it up and then I dropped it. And this is the big other, okay? Yeah. So the big other actually is never there, but the subject naturally picks it up and then it's not there, okay? You are different from going through an experience of relating to a big other that was never there than you would have been had you never related to a big other that was never there. Yeah. Right? And so it's as if there's a possible gain, actually, in a sublation negation, gain in value judgment, of which comes through relating to a big subject that was never there, if you choose it. Like, if you choose to say, wait a minute, I'm the slave, therefore I have the power. Right? And so, likewise, it's almost like in Hegel, in Heidegger, it's like all of Western philosophy was a mistake to hold a being that was never there. But actually, we need to go through the Western philosophy of a being that was never there so that we could be a being that never held a thing differently than having been a being that never held Western philosophy at all. Yeah. Right? You see what I'm saying? And so Heidegger's like, yeah, Western philosophy was a mistake, but actually we needed that mistake in order to be a subject that could recognize itself as never holding that thing and being different, even though it never held that thing.
Right, and that's the truth from error, you know? And that's where it's like, Heidegger, how much Hegel are you really, keeping from us? How much of a fanboy are you?
Well, this is what's weird. Well, for me, so for me, that's actually a really big point you just brought up. If 9 people who like never knew one another all end up on conclusion X, there would be very good reason to think that X has something to do with, the truth. But that's a loaded term. But there'd be very good reason to believe that X is true, right? Okay, if Hegel, Heidegger, Lacan, and all these different people, and I would also bring, I like to talk about the modern counter-enlightenment, which is an entire line of thinking that I think was ignored with Michel Panier, personal knowledge, Blondel.
Maurice Blondel,
yeah, all these different people. And they all seem to arrive at a structure of truth, of reality, all these loaded terms that is something about the releasing of a thing that was never there and being changed in that release. Well, if they all arrive at that, there would be very good reason to think that that's probably true, right? Because they all independently arrive at these things, or they arrive at it precisely when they say, I'm not going to end up like that guy because he's an idiot, and then they end up like that guy, kind of the Harold Bloom anxiety of influence kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, but you see, if they're all arriving at this sort of structure, a way I put it is return with the RE in parentheses. Okay, so it's like you have the return where you return to where you began, but it's not the same, right? Even if the journey you went on was a journey with a slash through it, right? So you see that kind of structure in Lacan, in different ways, in Lacan, in Hegel, and Heidegger, okay? They've all arrived at this, right? Kind of on their own, being genuine thinkers. Maybe they're subconsciously influenced. Of course, this is not a definite proof. But if they've all arrived at these kind of structures in their thinking, then there would be good reason to think that this structure is probably more true than false. And if this structure is more true than false, it is not possible under an A is A onto epistemology. Therefore, it functions as a proof of an AB onto epistemology, which is precisely where you could generate an AA that you think is there, but actually never was there. Like, that would be the big other, right? AA is the big other in this sense, right? And in AB, it's possible to believe in an AA that is not there, and at the end, you realize it was never there, and yet you're different, right? And you choose to believe that there's a difference in that. And so if they all kind of arrive at this independently, and I think other thinkers arrive at it as well, you could even bring in Alfred Korbowski in The Science of Sanity, which is a marvelous text that nobody read because it's impossible to read. But all of them have this sort of notion, or I guess Peter Geert as well. And that would friggin' suggest that there's something to all this. And all of this would then be embodied in that ability to say, the wine is different from the lumber. The wine that was created is different from this. These guys standing in a circle doing a cipher are different from other guys standing in a circle who haven't met the conditions to do the cipher, right? And what's so also crazy is the difference between the basketball game of ideology and the cipher of being is a very fine distinction.
Exactly, because if that's the case, then as you're saying, why can't we just say that, the grape is just the same as the lumber? Or what if, Biden signing a new, law is the same as a cipher? Yeah. It's like, no, there's distinct things, when it comes to the differential network. And again, I'm being, Lacanian, so I'm going to bring in language and consonants. But I'm sure that you could connote it with Heidegger, because I think there is a sort of semiotic structure that Heidegger was kind of getting at. With, his understanding of referentiality.
Oh, 100%. Well, if I were to use very giant terms that might not even be the best term, but to try to, so let's say Lacan is discourse, ideology, all that under the term discourse, and Heidegger is talking about some sort of evoking of being. It's almost as if Heidegger is suggesting that we need to do the work on the subject to be capable to evoke, so that we're not turned into lumber by the discourse, so that we're not turned into commodity marks. Okay, so I'll go back to the lumber wine language, because we are using all the languages in all the terms, Yes. Okay, so it's almost like what Lacan, what Marx is telling you is that you are captured in a system turning you to lumber. Okay, so there's a discourse that's going to turn you to lumber. Okay, and Heidegger's like, you are in the discourse, and you have to learn to evoke so that you are not turned to lumber and actually are wine. Okay.
Right.
Lacan would be tracing out the nature of the discourse so you don't get captured by it when you don't realize you're being captured from it. Because there's this problem where you could think you're evoking and doing everything Heidegger says when you're actually not. So you're actually falling into the big other without knowing it. So Lacan's doing all this work to be like, hey man, like let's see how the discourse structures you without you realizing it. So you need that work. But then let's say you knew but let's say you knew how the discourse worked. You knew how ideology worked, but you hadn't gained the ability of evoking from Heidegger. Therefore, you couldn't create the wine. But then you get the ability of Heidegger to evoke, which is also absolute knowing. And now you have the ability to stand in the discourse, to be the slave in the master-slave dialectic, who then has the power because you can evoke in the discourse, therefore structure yourself as a different subject of whom new being can disclose itself forth, and therefore present the possibility of standing outside the ideology in the ideology as an absolute knower.
Yes, that's the main thing. The key word is evoking, because Lacan says the same thing. It's like, again, I said it before in the earlier. It's like language is not this communicative thing. It is evocation, and it's always creating the other or the listener in a performativity, pretty much, whether unconscious or not. That I am speaking and so I'm speaking. I'm also performing and enunciating for the ears of the big other, right? Which escapes me.
Oh, the more we speak. So I've enjoyed this immensely. This has been wonderful. The more you're talking, the more I'm thinking like The Sound and the Fury actually would basically be the perfect novel to describe this Lacan, Hegel, Heideggerian structure, because in The Sound and the Fury, Quentin is the intellectual who's stuck in the discourse of intellectualism. Jason is the brother of anger who the South has fallen, and he's stuck in that discourse of tradition. And Benji is stuck in the inability to actually create together a structure of conceptual mediation by which to understand that Caddy is gone. And Caddy is the big other, of which everyone wants to get. That was never who they thought it was in the first place. Caddy was never Caddy in there. They have this vision of this perfect girl who actually was never that. And the unveiling that Caddy was never Caddy is what destroys the Compson family, more so than losing the Civil War. Like, they blame it on the Civil War and all that, but really it's the unveiling that the big other was never the big other. But it's precisely because of that it is possible for Dilsey, who endured, to stand in the middle of The Sound and Fury and not be consumed by it. It ends up being Dilsey, of whom acknowledges that the big other is not the big other, that becomes the correct response to The Sound and Fury, because he endured, and therefore stands in as an evoking of being that we find in absolute knowing. So the structure of The Sound and the Fury, which signifies nothing, the idiot strutting across the stage full of sound and fury, to the clocks of time, Dilsey becomes the endurance. And in that endurance, he can become the clearing in which being signs forth. So The Sound and the Fury, I think, would be a lovely structure in this way. This has been wonderful. Again, Andrew, I really, the work that you're doing with everyone, and with Mikey, Dave, and the universe, and I was also going to say with the university, Jasper's. I was actually laughing when he was like, "I'm not sure if it's Jasper." I've never known either, so the university should exist to give you the ability to evoke in discourse. Yes, that should be the role of the university, is to have the ability. But right now, the university exists to make you escape discourse, which ironically means you fall into discourse, because when you try to escape the big other, that's just what the big other wants. But really, the university should be conditioning you to be the kind of being of whom can evoke in discourse. And that, though, requires the humanities. That requires all these fields that the university says they care about, as they take you to be an investment banker or whatever. That was me. But the university should be part of this. But that work is wonderful. I'm really glad you're doing the early Zizek, because I think the book, it was mentioned, I think Mikey mentioned Conversations with Zizek, and that's actually a wonderful book, and he said that's a really good, like these texts by Zizek that people haven't read to go through.
I think that one talks about a lot of like his relation to Kant as well. And I've
actually been falling down a Kant rabbit hole as well to try to get away. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to reread everyone. Oh my god.
I'm reading a Kantian thinker right now, Kojin Karatani. He's the one who developed the parallax view that Zizek takes up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just funny. It's like, because I've been reading a lot of Konet, and he argues that Kant is not a Kantian, and I'm like, great.
Yes. I love that. Kant is not Kantian enough.
Great. That's great. Okay, let's see. But all the work, and Nick, again, I have never encountered anyone who is going through Lacan like you and Nick have been doing.
Yeah.
And I just think it's wonderful. I've gained a lot from it. It's really helped. It's the problem is I have things to finish. So every time I watch your videos and I spend 2 weeks, I'm like, it's really great. But that's a good thing because that means you're evoking being, not just falling into the discourse. It's all captured on the work. So I appreciate it very much, Andrew. So thank you.
Thank you.
Everything. This has been a treat. Thank you, sir. All right.